I walked into the restaurant with my tray held steady, shoulders tight, smile firmly in place. The kind of smile that hides everything you've carried all day, the exhaustion, the fear, the small cuts that come from being ignored, dismissed, treated as if your presence is a mistake. Tonight, the chandeliers glittered above like stars trapped inside crystal. The tables were set meticulously, each wine glass gleaming, each napkin folded perfectly. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits chatted quietly, their laughter polite and calculated. It was a world I had served in many times before, but tonight something felt different. He was there. The billionaire. White, tall, smug, perfectly groomed, and full of the arrogance that comes from never having to answer to anyone. He wasn't eating yet. He was standing near the entrance, talking on his phone, pointing at something or someone, with that same commanding presence that made people freeze in their tracks. And then our eyes met. I had served him before, always polite, always smiling, always invisible behind my smile. But tonight, something inside me refused to shrink. The fear that usually clung to my chest tightened for a moment and then loosened, replaced by a spark of clarity. As I approached his table, holding the tray with the appetizer he had ordered, I noticed the way he smirked, leaned forward slightly, and pointed at me. His guests stopped mid-sentence. Their eyes flickered toward me, uncertain. The air felt thick, like the room itself was holding its breath. "Really?" he said, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear, his tone dripping with amusement. "You? Here? This is first-class service, not whatever this is." Laughter rippled around him, polite but cruel, echoing in the space between tables. My stomach dropped. My hands shook ever so slightly. My smile, the one I had worn like armor for years, flickered. I pressed my lips together harder. "Yes, sir," I said softly, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. I set the tray down. "Right away." He leaned back, laughing, and pointed at me again. "I've never seen someone like you working here. Do you even know what you're doing?" The guests turned to look, whispering among themselves. Some glanced at me with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disdain. I felt the weight of their eyes, heavy and judgmental. My cheeks burned. Every humiliation I had endured in my life, the whispered remarks, the dismissed questions, the times I had been overlooked, rushed back at me like a tidal wave. I carried on, bringing his wine glass, my smile stiff, my head bowed slightly. But inside, something had shifted. The endless rehearsed submission, the practiced cheerfulness, the constant hiding, it was exhausting. And for the first time, I felt the urge not to smile. I set the glass in front of him with a calm precision that surprised even me. I met his eyes briefly, and in that moment I let the weight of the day, the weight of years, settle into my expression. Not a smile, not fear, just presence. The room fell slightly quieter, though no one said a word. He frowned, confused. Guests glanced around, uncertain why the moment had changed, why the air now carried tension instead of easy laughter. I walked away then, steady, controlled, holding the trays with a confidence I hadn't realized I possessed. But behind me, the whispers didn't stop. I could feel the sting of their judgment, the invisible fingers pointing at my presence. And yet, the spark had ignited. I knew even then that the night was far from over, and that the real story had just begun. The moment he laughed, I realized. Humiliation was a choice. I could let it consume me, or I could rise quietly, deliberately, and reclaim my dignity, one measured step at a time. And tonight, I decided that I would not let him define me. The restaurant hummed around me, chandeliers casting long, soft shadows across white tablecloths, the clinking of silverware and murmured conversations filling the spaces in between. But I could feel it, the weight of the eyes that had turned toward me after his laugh. Not just his eyes, but the collective gaze of wealth and privilege, silently judging, cataloging, questioning why I dared exist in that space. I kept moving, carrying trays, refilling glasses, my hands steady even as my chest felt tight. Each step echoed in the polished wooden floors, each breath measured. I had rehearsed this performance countless times. The smile, the slight bow of the head, the polite acknowledgement of a patron's presence. But tonight the armor felt heavier, and the cracks in it, small, subtle, were already showing. I saw him again, the billionaire, leaning back in his chair, watching me with that same smirk. His guests laughed quietly now, as if emboldened by his amusement, whispering to one another with the kind of hushed cruelty that only people who have never known struggle can muster. I felt their judgment like a brush across my skin, 1,000 tiny pinpricks that stung but did not draw blood. "Is this really how you serve people?" he called, louder this time, cutting through the hum of the room. The words were light, playful to him, but loaded with venom. He pointed again, and I could see the smirk deepen as if he were enjoying the spectacle of my discomfort. My hands clenched around the tray for a brief second, nails pressing into the wood. I had learned to take a breath, to steady myself, to remind myself, your worth is not measured by his amusement. But the sting of humiliation burned anyway, searing through years of invisibility, of being overlooked, of being underestimated because of the color of my skin. I approached the table, setting down a plate with precise care, my gaze briefly meeting his. "Your order, sir," I said, my voice calm, neutral, professional. No trace of fear, no trace of the smile he expected, just presence. For the first time, I noticed the flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Confusion at the lack of the usual reaction, the expected compliance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And it gave me a small, quiet satisfaction that I allowed myself to feel, hidden under the weight of his laughter. As I stepped back, I felt a hush fall over the surrounding tables. Conversations had not stopped, but there was a shift, an awareness that had not been there before. Guests who had whispered and giggled now looked unsure, scanning the room, sensing that the power dynamics they had assumed were unchallenged might not be as simple as they thought. I moved to refill water glasses at a nearby table, keeping my back straight, my head high. Each motion was deliberate, each step measured. I could hear him muttering under his breath, perhaps to his guests, perhaps to himself. I didn't care. I had learned to survive this, to navigate these spaces without breaking, without giving them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. And then it happened. A young man at another table, previously silent, leaned forward slightly, curiosity etched across his face. He spoke softly to his companion, but I heard it. "Why is she not scared?" I felt a spark. A small, growing flame of something I hadn't named yet, defiance, self-possession. The knowledge that I could exist fully in this space, even under the weight of their scrutiny, even under the sting of his humiliation. I went back to the kitchen briefly, trying to steady my racing heart. Chef passed me, offering a quiet nod. Even in this environment, a silent acknowledgement of skill, of composure, of being seen in a world that preferred to ignore me. I held onto that nod like a lifeline, letting it remind me that I was more than his amusement, more than the judgment of those frozen, polite guests. Returning to the floor, I carried the tray with renewed resolve. Every motion precise, every interaction measured. I would not give him the satisfaction of my faltering. I would not shrink under his gaze. I would be present, visible, undeniable. And then he spoke again. Louder this time, a command disguised as a joke. You should be smiling while you work. Isn't that what people like you do? The words hit, sharp, cutting, but this time I didn't falter. I didn't give the smile. I didn't look away. I simply met his eyes, and in that moment, a quiet, unshakable statement was made. I exist here not for your amusement, not for your comfort, not to perform the image you expect. I exist here because I am worthy, because my presence is valid, because my dignity is not negotiable. The room shifted. I could feel it. The guests sensed it. Some looked uncomfortable, some impressed, some unsure. He froze mid-gesture, the smirk faltering. And I realized then that humiliation, when met with quiet strength, begins to unravel its power. And that was only the beginning. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath after my small act of defiance. Guests who had been laughing, whispering, or pretending not to notice suddenly shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Silver spoons paused mid-air, champagne glasses trembled in delicate hands, and the murmur of polite conversation turned tentative. Even the staff, usually moving in seamless choreography, seemed to hesitate, sensing the tension like a taut wire stretched across the room. He, the billionaire, sat frozen, his hand halfway to his mouth as if to correct his laughter, only to realize that I wasn't the same woman who had flinched under his eyes moments ago. I carried my tray with steady precision, moving as though the world around me had narrowed into a single axis, me and my own dignity. You see, I whispered to myself as I placed another plate, carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone except the customers I served. This is your world, but you don't get to define me in it. He leaned back in his chair, a gesture meant to reclaim authority, to signal that he controlled this space. Smile, he barked, louder now, as if volume could bend me to his will. A little charm, a little gratitude for your position. I stopped. My hands stilled on the tray, my breath even. For the first time, I allowed my gaze to lock with his fully unflinching. Not anger, not fear, just presence. And then the tiniest twitch of uncertainty appeared on his face. A smirk carefully constructed over years of power and privilege faltered. The room noticed. I walked away, deliberately slow, each step measured. Every eye followed me, some in curiosity, some in disbelief. I heard whispers. Who is she? Why isn't she afraid? The weight of their assumptions pressed against me like invisible hands, but I refused to bend, refused to break, refused to perform the role he expected. Back in the kitchen, the cool air was a brief reprieve. The chef gave me a quick, acknowledging nod, a silent signal that he understood the stakes of what I was doing. It wasn't just service. It was survival, it was resistance, it was claiming my space in a room designed to make me invisible. When I returned to the floor, the scene was different. The guests were uneasy. Conversations had slowed. Some leaned toward one another, glancing my way as if measuring whether my audacity would succeed or fail. He tried to regain control, waving a hand, attempting to mask his frustration with a forced laugh. "She's talented," he said, almost joking. "Just needs a little polish." The words were meant to belittle, but the audience didn't respond with laughter this time. Something in the air had shifted, an invisible line had been crossed, and even his influence couldn't pull it back. I moved past him again, delivering a glass of wine with careful grace, and felt the flicker of something I hadn't anticipated: respect. Not from him, not yet, but from others watching. His guests, accustomed to passive compliance, now saw defiance framed in calm elegance. The contrast unsettled them, revealing a dynamic they weren't prepared to witness. A young man at a nearby table, previously silent, muttered to his companion, "She's not scared." I caught the phrase on the edge of hearing, and for a moment my heart surged. A tiny victory, but one that mattered. Even in this space, I had managed to challenge their expectations without raising my voice. The billionaire shifted in his chair again, the veneer of amusement cracking further. His eyes darted around the room, searching for affirmation, for reassurance from those who usually bolstered his ego. But the room had changed. The whispers weren't just about me, they were about him. Who he was, what he represented, and how quickly the power of humiliation can unravel in the presence of quiet, unwavering dignity. I continued my work, balancing trays and refilling drinks, every step deliberate, every gesture precise. He tried one more time, calling my name with a laugh designed to shame me, but I ignored him, focusing instead on the customers who deserved attention, on the rhythm of service that reminded me that competence is a form of resistance. And then something remarkable happened. A woman seated near the back of the room, someone who hadn't spoken yet, rose slightly in her chair. She looked directly at me, eyes shining with recognition. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition. She nodded once subtly, and I felt the spark of solidarity, the unspoken acknowledgement that I was not alone. I realized then that the humiliation I had endured, the pointed laughter, the sneers, the silent judgments, was a test of presence. And with every measured step, every calm response, I was passing it. Not for him, not for the guests, but for myself. The tension in the room had transformed. The air no longer carried the expectation that I would bend, that I would break, that I would apologize for existing. Instead, it pulsed with anticipation. Something was about to happen, something that would make them all reconsider not just me, but the assumptions they carried. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the next encounter, knowing that the moment of reversal, the one that would shatter their expectation, was drawing closer. And in that moment, I felt a quiet power awaken within me, a strength that had been there all along but had waited for this exact circumstance to reveal itself. The room had shifted in ways subtle yet undeniable. Every step I took was watched, every gesture measured, every glance noted. The guests who had been amused moments ago now carried something heavier: uncertainty. They weren't laughing anymore. They were questioning. They were noticing. He, the billionaire, had lost some of his composure. His usual air of invincibility faltered. He tried to wave his authority back into existence, making a pointed comment to a waiter nearby, but it landed hollow. The room no longer responded with the automatic deference he was used to. Instead, there was hesitation, a quiet awareness that his power was being tested in a way he hadn't expected. I moved past his table again, tray steady, spine straight. Each step was deliberate, a silent assertion. I would not perform for you. I would not be your spectacle. I would not bend for your ego. And yet I maintained the grace expected of someone in my position, a waitress, a server, a face meant to please without thought or friction. "Don't get too confident," he whispered to himself, more to the air than anyone around him, but I heard it. I kept moving. I delivered water to the table at the corner, smiled faintly at a guest who nodded in acknowledgement, and felt the subtle shift in attention away from him and toward me. Then it happened. A sharp alarm cut through the hum of the restaurant, a device on his table, a small, discreet monitor I hadn't noticed, beeped loudly, insistent, impossible to ignore. The sound drew every eye, including mine, and froze the room in suspended tension. He looked down, confused, his perfectly composed expression cracking. "Excuse me," I said quietly, approaching the table. I didn't ask permission. I didn't apologize. I simply walked up, holding the tray as if it were armor. "Sir, there's a malfunction with your device. It needs immediate attention." The billionaire's face flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and irritation. He waved a dismissive hand, trying to mask the panic that his power couldn't contain. "It's nothing," he said, voice tight, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. But the alarm persisted. A light flashed on the monitor. Red, insistent, unyielding. Guests leaned forward, noticing, murmuring quietly. The delicate balance of the room, his authority, the illusion of control, began to crumble. I stood by, calm, unyielding, waiting for the inevitable unraveling. And then the moment arrived. The monitor projected an image, an error in the system, yes, but one that exposed something he hadn't intended anyone to see. Financial data, secret donations, contracts, unethical dealings, all flashing on the screen, impossible to ignore. The room collectively inhaled. Gasps, whispers, shifting eyes. The attention was no longer on me, it was on him, on the facade he had carefully curated for years, now laid bare in cinematic clarity. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by disbelief. "This is," he started, but no one listened. The guests were already processing the reality displayed in front of them. The waiter at the next table whispered to his companion. I didn't know, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the truth, finally surfacing, cutting through the layers of privilege, arrogance, and humiliation he had wielded like a weapon. "Everyone," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart, "perhaps now we can focus on what really matters: integrity, honesty, and accountability." I didn't shout. I didn't demand applause. I simply stated it, letting the room absorb the weight of the moment. The billionaire's face turned red, then paled. He attempted to speak again, to regain control, but the room no longer answered to him. Even his allies hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or step back in shock. The spell of authority he had relied upon for years had been broken in an instant, by circumstance, by the truth, and by the quiet resilience of someone he thought powerless. For the first time, the guests saw me, not as a waitress, not as a background figure, but as the pivot around which the entire narrative had turned. Every whisper that had humiliated me earlier now seemed hollow, insignificant. The power had shifted, not because I sought it, but because I had refused to surrender it. I returned to my station, tray in hand, calm and composed. He sank back into his seat, defeated, his carefully constructed image shattered, and for the first time the room was free of his oppressive presence. The guests, some shocked, some reflective, began to regain their composure, looking at one another with a new awareness. And I realized then something profound. Humiliation can be turned if only one possesses the patience, the strength, and the quiet courage to endure it. The night was far from over, but the course had changed. The billionaire would never command the room the same way again, and I would never forget the exact moment the world paused to witness that reversal. The room was silent, but not in the way silence usually feels. This was the heavy, taut kind that hangs in the air when every person knows something irreversible has just happened. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the billionaire, and for the first time, his composure didn't return. The air around him crackled with the realization that his authority, his ego, his carefully constructed facade had crumbled in seconds. I kept moving through the restaurant, my steps deliberate, my tray steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Guests looked at me now with curiosity and newfound respect. Some whispered under their breath, their faces no longer hidden behind polite smiles. Others stared openly, trying to reconcile the spectacle they had witnessed with the elegant, familiar environment they had believed untouchable. He tried to speak, fumbling over words that had always flowed effortlessly. This is, he began, but his voice faltered. The monitor continued to display the data, flashing like a neon spotlight on every misstep, every unethical maneuver he had attempted to hide. He realized that no explanation, no charm, no wealth could erase the reality of what the room now saw. The guests leaned in closer, murmuring among themselves, some openly judging, some shaking their heads in disbelief. I felt the shift. It wasn't just that he was embarrassed. It was that the power balance had completely changed. Where he once commanded attention and submission, now he was the object of scrutiny. And I, once the target of ridicule and humiliation, had become the quiet force around which everyone's attention now revolved. I approached his table again, this time without hesitation. "Sir," I said calmly, "perhaps now would be a good moment to acknowledge what's happening and address it responsibly." My words were steady, deliberate, not confrontational, not accusatory, simply truth spoken with quiet authority. He froze, the full weight of the room pressing down on him. For the first time, the mask slipped entirely, revealing vulnerability and panic in the starkest form. He looked at me, perhaps realizing that the person he had attempted to humiliate had not only endured but had risen above him. Some guests applauded, quietly at first, then with more confidence as the tension eased and the room began to breathe collectively again. The staff around us exchanged glances of disbelief and admiration. I had become a symbol not of revenge, but of dignity, resilience, and the power of refusing to be diminished. Then, unexpectedly, the billionaire's assistant stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. "Sir, perhaps we should leave," she said softly, understanding the inevitable. He glared at her, then at the room, then finally, slowly, he nodded. His power, his aura of untouchability, had been irrevocably shaken. As they left, the room exhaled. Guests whispered to each other, some offering words of support, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the magnitude of what had just occurred. The tension that had been suffocating just minutes ago dissipated, leaving a charged but lighter atmosphere. I returned to the kitchen briefly, setting down the tray. My hands trembled, but not from fear. This was adrenaline, relief, and quiet triumph wrapped together. The humiliation I had endured earlier, the pointed looks, the whispered insults, all of it had been transformed into something larger. The universe had witnessed the reversal, and I had remained intact, upright, unshaken. From the corner of my eye, I saw the other staff members glance at me, some silently mouthing congratulations, some offering discreet nods. It was more than recognition. It was acknowledgement that integrity, composure, and quiet resilience could turn the tide, even in the face of wealth and arrogance. I looked back toward the empty table, now stripped of its intimidating presence. The monitor still blinked faintly in the background, a quiet reminder that truth always finds its way to the surface. And I realized that the story wouldn't be about the billionaire anymore. It would be about me, my endurance, my courage, my refusal to perform for cruelty. I caught a glimpse of a young waitress nearby, her eyes wide, inspired. Perhaps she too would carry this lesson, that humiliation could be turned into strength, that power was not just in wealth or status, but in dignity, integrity, and courage under pressure. The rest of the night passed in a haze of whispered conversations, cautious glances, and quiet admiration. And as I continued to serve, every step reminded me that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the room, but in myself. I would never again allow someone else's arrogance to dictate my self-worth, my pride, or my dignity. The billionaire's departure left a void, a silence that spoke louder than any words. And in that silence, I finally allowed myself a small, private smile. The smile that had been taken from me earlier, the smile I had withheld as an act of quiet defiance, now fully reclaimed. The restaurant had returned to its quiet hum, the candles flickering gently over polished tables, the faint clinking of glasses echoing softly through the room. But for me, everything had changed. Nothing looked the same. The walls that had once felt oppressive, the wealthy guests who had stared judgmentally, the billionaire whose smirk had haunted me, they were all diminished in comparison to the strength I now carried. I walked past the tables, each step deliberate, feeling the weight of every stare, every whisper. But now they were not eyes filled with scorn, they were eyes filled with recognition. People noticed me. Not just for the service I provided, but for the courage I had displayed, the dignity I had refused to compromise, the humanity I had preserved. From the corner of the room, I saw him, the billionaire. He lingered near the exit, his face pale, his posture stiff. He had expected fear. He had expected submission. What he hadn't expected was truth. And truth had a way of shifting the world quietly, irreversibly. I approached the final table I needed to serve, my tray steady in my hands, and set it down with care. I looked up, meeting his eyes directly. For a moment, the arrogance he always wielded like armor wavered, then cracked. I didn't need to say a word. The room had already spoken. He tried to muster a smile, an attempt at dominance, but it failed. The room was no longer his stage. His power, carefully curated over years of wealth and influence, had evaporated in the glare of integrity. Guests murmured softly, some shaking their heads, some whispering to each other. Their attention had shifted. Respect had found its way to the quietest corner of the room, the corner where I stood. I remembered the moments of humiliation, the smirks, the pointed finger, the expectation that I would smile through the pain. But I hadn't smiled then. I hadn't given him the satisfaction. And now the room had witnessed the result. My silence had been louder than any words. My restraint had been more powerful than any argument. The waiter beside me, someone I had mentored quietly over the weeks, gave me a small nod. I nodded back. The acknowledgement was unspoken, but understood. The message was clear. Power can be confronted without aggression, cruelty can be answered with dignity, and humiliation can be transformed into quiet strength. Then, unexpectedly, the billionaire's assistant stepped forward again. Her voice was low but firm. "Sir, it's time to leave. The guests are unsettled, and it's best we go." He looked around the room, the realization settling like a weight in his chest. There was nowhere to hide, no performance to control, no charm to reclaim. As they exited, I felt the room exhale collectively. The tension dissipated, replaced by a mixture of admiration and awe. People looked at me now not as a server, not as someone to be dismissed, but as a force, a reminder that courage, composure, and dignity cannot be bought, cannot be intimidated, and cannot be erased. I returned to the kitchen briefly, setting my tray down, my hands finally steady. The humiliation of earlier felt distant now, replaced with something infinitely stronger: empowerment. The entire evening, every pointed finger, every insult, every attempt to diminish me had been transformed into a story of triumph. A few guests approached, offering quiet congratulations, their eyes sincere. Some whispered words of encouragement, others simply smiled knowingly. I realized then that the moment had passed beyond me. It had become a lesson for everyone present. A lesson that arrogance cannot silence truth, that cruelty cannot crush dignity, and that a single act of courage can ripple through an entire room. I walked to the window overlooking the city lights, the glow reflecting on my face. The world outside hadn't changed, but the way I saw it had. No longer would I shrink from authority, no longer would I give anyone the satisfaction of my submission. My strength had been tested and proven. And then, quietly, I smiled. Not the forced, polite smile of a server enduring injustice. Not the hesitant smile of someone hoping to survive scrutiny. This was my smile, the one I had withheld all evening, the one I had used as armor, the one I now allowed to shine freely. Because in that moment, I knew nothing, not wealth, not arrogance, not humiliation, could touch the essence of who I was. My power was not borrowed, it was mine, and it had been witnessed. As the last guests left and the restaurant emptied, I remained, standing tall amidst the polished tables and flickering candlelight. The billionaire's shadow lingered only in memory. And I understood finally, fully, the truth I had lived all along. Courage, dignity, and silence in the face of cruelty can be more devastating than any confrontation. I had survived. I had risen. And the world, if only for a moment, had seen me, not as someone to be humiliated, but as someone to be remembered.